Good afternoon. We're here today to welcome Dr. Ted Karamanski, a professor of history at Loyola University Chicago, as a part of the One Book, One College program relating, of course, to Tony Horowitz's work, Confederates in the Attic. Professor Karamanski has been a prolific writer, and his work, Rally Round the Flag, examines, of course, Chicago and the impact the Civil War had on that particular city. I'd like to thank, of course, the library as well as Dr. Troy Swanson, the Liberal Arts Department, Dr. Jenkins, of course, the college president, and Dr. Franzik, the Dean of Liberal Arts. Without further ado, Dr. Ted Karamanski.
Thanks, Josh, and thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm sure you already had enough classes this morning. We'll try to go ahead and make this a little bit entertaining, as well as hopefully informative. 150 years ago, America was locked in the same kind of ugly struggle that you see in a place like Syria today, where the country's divided, the infrastructure is being destroyed, and it looks, if you think back to 1863, it looks like there's no end in sight to the horror and the destruction that war is bringing. I'm particularly happy to be at Moraine Valley because not only do I live in the area, but I also went to community college myself. In those days, I was in Chicago, so I went to Daly College, and it was really an excellent start for me to begin my college career, and then later on I went to university. But it was a good way to save some money and to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And as I figured out what I wanted to do, it turned toward history. And as I got into history, I became very interested in the Civil War. And when we think of this Chicago in the Civil War, or Chicago in the 19th century in particular, the subject that comes up is the Great Fire, as if this is like the great event of Chicago in the 19th century. The fact of the matter is, the south side of Chicago didn't burn at all during the Great Fire. This was just something that affected downtown and the north side. And just like they always are crying about their cubs, they go ahead and make a big deal about this fire. One thing that I discovered, however, about the fire is that it destroyed so many of the letters and documents and souvenirs that the soldiers brought back from the Civil War. So when we try to understand how something like the Civil War affected Chicago, the fire made it difficult. It, in some ways, erased some of the institutional memory of the city. But you only have to drive around Chicago with your eyes open to get a sense of what the war meant to the people who fought that conflict, to the generation of the Civil War. They left us many, many traces on the city's landscape to say to us, this is what was important about our generation. This is what we did for our country. You know, we've got statues of Lincoln in Lincoln Park. We got statues of Lincoln in Grant Park. We got statues of Grant in Lincoln Park. We got statues of General Sheridan, General Logan. There's at least a dozen statues of Lincoln, as well as other generals around Chicago. We even have statues to the Confederates in Chicago. So the Civil War memory was very important to these people. And the reason was because when this war began, Illinois was in an area of the country they called the Northwest. We were off in the fringe of the country, on the edge of a frontier. But if it hadn't been for the contributions of those states on the fringe, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, these are the states that saved the Union. These are the states that provided the backbone of the armies that destroyed the Confederacy. And when they came back from that war, they saw themselves and their region different. And after the Civil War, this area is not referred to as the Northwest. It's referred to instead as the Heartland. And they saw what they had done as everything that had ever happened in American history that was important had happened in the East. The Revolution, War of 1812, things like that. And after the Civil War, they saw what they had done is they'd rescued the work of the Founding Fathers. And that they felt this cemented their contribution, not just in the center of the American economy or the American geography. They saw themselves as being in the center of American history. And that's why we have Grant Park. That's why we have Lincoln Park. That's why we have license plates that say Land of Lincoln today. Because for that generation, this was a crowning experience and a coming of age for the region. There are so many memorials to the Civil War in Chicago also because of the fearful cost that was paid by the country. And we're 750,000 Americans dead. That's more than the equivalent of 2% of the population today. If it was today, we'd be talking about close to 6.5 million people dead. And in terms of 450,000 widows, close to 200,000, 450,000 orphans, and close to 200,000 widows. Hundreds of thousands of wounded people who'd lost limbs were haunting the streets of our cities for the next generation. And so the war was a very bitter conflict in which a high price was paid by America. Such a high price that you could combine all the wars that America ever fought, before or since, and it would not equal the death and destruction of the American Civil War. And for the people of Chicago, the terrible price that was going to be paid to save the Union and end slavery was made apparent to them in April of 1862 at the Battle of Shiloh. This one battle, which kind of, just burst on the scene, shocking everybody. This one battle cost more Americans their life than all the wars that the country had fought up to that time. There was a Confederate politician who said when the war began that this was going to be an easy process, secession, and that any of the blood that was spilled, he'd be happy to mop up with his handkerchief. Well, the blood just at at Shiloh, was such that no one could conceivably mop it all up. And this really affected Chicago and Illinois because such a large percentage of Grant's army, a third of it, were from Illinois. This battle was fought in Tennessee, which was just a day's train ride away on the Illinois Central Railroad. And when people heard about this conflict, they knew the army was totally unprepared to deal with the wounded. So many of the wounded actually laid on the battlefield for 2, 3, 4, in some cases 5 days. And it rained most of those days. And the only way those soldiers got off the battlefield is because people came from Chicago as volunteer nurses and took them off the battlefield. Doctors came down and began to tend to the wounded. So there was a close bond between the battlefield and the home front that's very important in the Civil War. It's a very sad thing for the troops that have fought so long and hard in Iraq and Afghanistan that for most Americans, these conflicts are out of sight and out of mind. It's a little background noise on the nightly news. But that wasn't the case in the Civil War because the war was fought in our backyard. And one of the things that happened very early in that conflict is something that happens in all wars. And that is that we were fighting our own citizens, right? Sort of they talked a little funny, but they were Americans too. And very early in the war, this process of demonizing the enemy of turning the enemy not into one of us, but into another. And so you began to see publications like the Chicago Tribune printing articles about, Confederate soldiers are going ahead and digging up the bodies of dead Union soldiers and taking their bones and whittling them into souvenirs that they're giving to their girlfriends in the sunny South. They tried to make the argument that slavery, one of the most inhuman practices in American history, had turned the Southerners into barbarians.
And so you can see some of that in this
Graphic. And this affected the way Americans, the way Chicagoans related to
people from the South.
And this is very well demonstrated at the Camp Douglas prisoner of war camp. One of the largest prisoner of war camps in the United States was located on the south side of Chicago. It was called Camp Douglas. And eventually there were 64,000 Confederates who were incarcerated there during the course of the Civil War.
These people had a very miserable time.
One of the prisoners there was this fellow here, Henry Stanley. He was a young Welshman who came to the United States and enlisted in the Confederate Army, even though he'd been only in the country a few months. He later became kind of famous, Henry Stanley. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Pardon me? Stanley Steel? No. Like the Tool Works? Yeah, no. That's a good one, though. Yeah, an earlier generation would have been more onto this, but he became an African explorer, actually someone who was a very brutal colonizer of Africa for the King of Belgium. But he was famous for discovering a lost missionary in Africa, and he came across him and he said, "Dr. Livingston, I presume," which was a famous quote in the 19th century. But his early experience was in the Civil War, and what he saw at Camp Douglas was awful. He saw so many of his comrades who had come to the camp healthy getting sick. Sick with dysentery, sick with typhoid fever, sick with smallpox, and they began to die. And they were carted out of the camp day after day, he said, in the same way like carcasses are carted into a slaughterhouse. He realized this was not a good thing. And so he became what was known as a galvanized Yankee. He took the oath of allegiance to the United States of America, promised to obey the Constitution of the United States, and became a Union soldier because he felt the only way to get out of Camp Douglas alive was to
turn coat.
Eventually, there were over 4,000 Confederates who died at Camp Douglas. So there are more Confederates buried in Chicago than on any Civil War battlefield. And they died hungry, they died diseased in the heart of one of the largest cities in the United States, in the food distribution center for the United States. And these conditions prevailed in large part because people wanted to see the Confederates suffer. The Chicago Board of Trade actually petitioned President Lincoln to reduce rations at Camp Douglas so that the men there would suffer more. This was the degree of bitterness that grew up in the war, but it's also a byproduct of that close bond between the soldiers on the home front, the soldiers on the battlefront,
and the people at the home front.
This is what you can see in that small picture where Camp Douglas is located today.
And it's a
the Lake Meadows housing complex is there. Last summer, I worked with archaeologists to try to excavate the remains of the camp. And we dug down at the camp headquarters building, and we found what might have been a foundation, but we didn't find much in the way of artifacts from the prisoners or from the guards. And so we're hoping this summer to excavate at another site and perhaps get
more in the way of remains.
And if you go to Oakwood Cemetery near Cottage Grove and 67th Street on Chicago's South Side, you'll see the largest mass grave in the United States, where all of these bodies were eventually dumped, very unceremoniously. It wasn't until 1890 that they dedicated a memorial to all those Confederates who died in Chicago. Now, fortunately, the war did more than just bring out this sense of bitterness, this desire to punish the enemy. There was also a lot of idealism that was unleashed, because this, after all, was a war that could only be sustained by the promise that we would make a new and better America. And the abolition of slavery, of course, was a big part of that.
And so it drew the idealism of many people, very especially
a group of women who were involved in something called
called the Sanitary Commission.
And the leader of the Sanitary Commission in Illinois was a woman by the name of Mary Livermore. And in spite of having a very large family, numerous young children, she got deeply involved in war work. She was anxious to try to help the troops. She went once for a short stint nursing at the front, but she couldn't be away from her family long. So she wanted to do what she could do in Chicago to help them. And when she heard that the Sanitary Commission had run out of money supplying fruits and vegetables to fight scurvy in Grant's army outside Vicksburg, she said she went to the men who were on the board that ran the organization. Because while there were women that actually did the work, the men were in charge. And she went to them and she said, okay, what can us ladies do to get funds for the organization? And they said, well, there's really not too much you can do. Thanks for your offer. And she said, well, look, we're going to try. Well, what do you want to do? She said, well, we'll have like a fair and we'll sell things. And they laughed at her. They laughed at her and said, oh, okay, you know how sometimes the student organizations sell cupcakes or mimosas or whatever for snacks to raise a little money for the organization. They thought this is what she had in mind. But Mary Livermore was a woman of uncommon organizational ability. And so she put together a network of women throughout the Midwest region. She brought representatives to Chicago. She instructed them, we want you to send to Chicago the best products of every town, every county in the Midwest region. And these things began to flow in, as well as donations of money. Soon she had every one of the municipal halls in the city rented, where she was going to sell these wares. And she still didn't have enough space for all the stuff that was coming in. So she said, okay, we're going to build a new building. And she had donated lumber and building materials. So she wrote a contract, and she had these construction workers to build what was then the largest public hall in Chicago. She went to the construction site then, and she saw the workers just sitting there. She says, oh, guys, this fair is going to be opening up in a few weeks. You've got to get going. They said, we can't work until we have a legitimate contract. I gave you a contract. Yeah, you gave us a contract. You're a woman. You don't have a legal right to sign a contract. So we can't work until you get your husband to sign this contract. Well, Mary Livermore, she chewed her tongue on that one. She thought, okay, one war at a time. She got the husband to sign the contract. They built
the hall.
and she went ahead and organized this fantastic thing they called the Northwest Sanitary Fair. And it lasted for several weeks. And people poured into the city to participate there. They had record sales. And in this hall that she had built, she had a food court, she had shoe stores, she had a women's clothing store, she had a men's clothing store, she had a theater. Long before genius, there were geniuses like Marshall Field in Chicago. He thought he knew about merchandising. But he didn't get it. Mary Livermore invented the shopping mall. And nobody picked up on it for another century.
When the fair was over,
Mary went to the men who were on the board of the Sanitary Commission. By this time, they'd seen what she had done, and they were very happy to see her. They said, well, Mary, what do you have for us? And she gave them a check for $75,000, which in those days was a huge amount of money. And all they could say to her was, Mary, when can you do it again? And she did organize another fair for Chicago, and she then helped organize other fairs all around the country, in all the cities of the North. And they eventually raised over $6 million for the troops, for their medical care of the wounded, and to help soldiers who were recovering from wounds on their way home. They built in Chicago, and you can still see it at 35th Street and Lakeshore Drive, they built something called the Soldiers' Home. And it's for any soldiers who were passing through Chicago who might have a relapse of an illness or a disease. It was a safe place for them to stay, where they could get a meal, they could get a bed, they could stay for months, they could stay for years if they needed to. And she had subsidized all of this activity. Oh, there's the building. Another one of the people inspired by the challenges that the war brought was George Frederick Root. Before the war, he was just a publisher of liturgical music, stuff they'd sing in church. But when the war began, he got excited by the energy that he saw in the population and the enthusiasm that he saw among the people, and he began to write songs to encourage the war effort. And his greatest song, written for a war rally in Chicago in July 1862, when Lincoln said, hey, we need a lot more troops if we're going to try to win this war. They had to have these big war rallies to get people excited, to get the young men to enlist. He wrote this song called The Battle Cry of Freedom. And in those days, when you'd bring 50,000 people together in an assembly, there was no public address system. So the only way to address large crowds was to set up a variety of speakers platforms in different corners of the assembly area. And on one of these assembly areas, a group of singers started to sing this song that Root had written for the rally. This song, The Battle Cry of Freedom. And the song was sung there. People in the audience began to sing it. And before the song was completed, the song had moved around. Everybody was singing the chorus of this song. And it's probably the best-selling single song in American history. This song, this is before they had, some of you may remember 8-track cassettes or cassette tapes, or even those things they used to call CDs. Well before MP3 players. The only way to buy music was to buy sheet music. And this song sold 150,000 copies of sheet music at a time when the population of the North was 20 million people. So there was way more than the people who could read or play the piano, right? People just wanted this sheet music, just to even have the lyrics. And the song had a big impact on the military. It was an important way to raise the morale. And a classic example of this is at the Battle of Stones River, a battle that is very often forgotten in the Civil War. But in terms of the number of troops engaged, it was the most vicious and deadly battle of the Civil War. And it was fought on the last day of December and the second day of January, 1863. Cold battle, cold weather. And the Confederate troops attacked and attacked, and they kept pushing the Union forces, but they refused to retreat. And after all these attacks, the Union Army held its ground. And the Confederates were forced to retreat. And Lincoln said, if it wasn't for this battle, he thought his government would have collapsed at that time. If he had a defeat. This was after the disastrous defeat at Fredericksburg that the Army had suffered. And so now the Army in the West, however, had stood their ground and won. And as the Confederates were retreating, the officer in charge of their rear guard looked across the frozen surface of Stones River, and he saw the Union campfires. And the soldiers were gathered around the campfires, and they were singing this song, We'll rally around the flag. We'll rally around the flag. And he turned to his adjutant, and the Confederate officer said, I don't think we can beat these guys. We've attacked them through two of the most miserable days we've ever been through. And they're still ready to fight, and they're singing they're going to rally around the flag. This idealism of people like Mary Livermore and George Frederick Root, this went ahead and carried on even to the next generation. And a classic example of this was a young girl. She was only 6 years old at the time of the Civil War. On an April day in 1865, she'd been out playing with friends. And she came in to her house, and she saw that there was black crepe hanging from the door, which was always a symbol of mourning in those days. And she went into the parlor, and in the shadows her father sat with tears streaking down his face. And he put his arm around her and said, Jane, the greatest man in the world's been killed. And that's how she found out about the death of Abraham Lincoln. Does anybody know who that woman is in that picture? Does that look familiar at all? Famous South Sider? Jane Addams. That's right. Jane Addams was just a young girl. Her father was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln's. Her assistant, Jane Addams created Hull House, which was a way to help immigrants to America adjust to life in the new country, to help them learn English, to help them learn civics, to help them get jobs. But she was always inspired by Abraham Lincoln. And Hull House was located where the University of Illinois Chicago campus is today. But whenever she would get discouraged, and she would get discouraged a lot because she had to work with Chicago politicians, and that's no easy job for anybody. And when she would get discouraged, she would think of Lincoln. And in 1887, they built a statue to Lincoln in Lincoln Park, as you see there. She would walk from Hull House at the University of Illinois Chicago campus to Lincoln Park. So you know she was mad about something if she needed to walk that far to kind of work it out. But she would go there, and she would look up at the statue, and she wrote an autobiography. You can read it in the library here. That she saw that Lincoln was the epitome of all that was great and good in America. And just looking at his face, thinking about what he had done in his life, was like a refreshing breeze from off of the lake. And it went ahead and gave her the strength to carry on, as she did through her whole life, really helping to build a progressive Chicago. Another one of the great features that comes out of the Civil War, of the idealism of the Civil War, is those people who worked in the Sanitary Commission. They wanted to go ahead and make Chicago a better place after the war. And so they got together and they built Chicago's Lakefront Parks. Jackson Park, Lincoln Park, and Washington Park were all designed by veterans of the United States Sanitary Commission. Frederick Law Olmsted, William LeBaron Jenney, and Ezra McCadd. Now, a lot of guys from our neighborhood also participated in the Civil War and made extraordinary sacrifice. Most of the people from this part of Cook County served in the 39th Illinois Infantry. And if you've ever seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, they show this very awful attack made by the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first African-American units in the Civil War. This awful attack they made on the Confederate fortress of Fort Wagner. And that attack, unfortunately, was a failure in spite of the heroism of the troops. But it was the 39th Illinois that eventually successfully captured Fort Wagner several months later. And in the Battle of Petersburg, the battle that finally broke Lee's army, Henry Hardenberg, a young man from Tinley Park, won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And it was the 39th Illinois that then pursued Lee's army out of Petersburg and were part of the army that forced the surrender at Appomattox that brought about the end of the war.
And you can see they suffered pretty heavy.
A regiment of soldiers has 1,000 men. And out of the
1,000 men,
they've suffered pretty high casualties,
with a very large number simply from disease.
Now, not everybody was a patriot in Chicago during the Civil War, that's for darn sure. And one of the people who was most controversial was this fellow here, Wilbur F. Story. Story was the most brilliant journalist in Chicago. He really knew how to convey the news in a colorful fashion. Once after he covered an execution at Joliet State Prison, anybody ever been down to the State Prison on Archer Road there? So he covered the execution there, and so the headline in the Chicago Times the next day was, "Jerked to Jesus." He went ahead and also, however, was a bitter racist. And he said the most awful things about African Americans and was a staunch defender of slavery as an institution and a bitter enemy of Abraham Lincoln because Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He heaped a mountain of
Purple prose upon the president after he did so.
He didn't even like the Gettysburg Address. Nothing Lincoln did was good enough for this guy.
But on the other hand,
one of the things that Wilbur Story did was he tried to defend civil liberties. He tried to defend people's right to say unpopular things in the course of a war. And while people called him traitor in some cases, others called him a hero because he would
go ahead and say those,
defend the right of free speech. And he literally had to do that because Ambrose Burnside, who was the commander of Union forces behind the lines, he decided to close down the Chicago Times because they were attacking Lincoln too much. This is a complete violation of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And the only reason that Story's newspaper was allowed to reopen was because a mob of Democratic readers, people who opposed the Lincoln administration, took to the streets and they threatened to burn down a brand new Chicago Tribune, which was a Republican newspaper, the brand new Chicago Tribune building. And the Tribune, in a panic, wired Abraham Lincoln and said, "Tell Burnside to open up the Times again before we lose our new building." Story played a huge role in the Democratic Party convention that was held in Chicago in 1864. That convention basically pursued a peace plank. They wanted to go ahead and end the Civil War, negotiate with the Confederacy, recognize the independence of the southern states, and abandon the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a very popular thing to say in the summer of 1864, with Grant's army stalled outside Richmond and Sherman stalled outside Atlanta. It looked like Lincoln's military effort was a failure. But fortunately, Union forces were able to turn the tide in the fall,
and Lincoln was reelected.
That went ahead and really bothered the Confederate government. They knew they lost their best chance to win the war. And by that time, they were deeply involved with trying to subvert the North, particularly the Midwestern states that were so critical to Lincoln's war effort, subvert them internally. So they, for example, they paid for a whole series of candidates in the 1864 election in Illinois. So the biggest contributor was the Confederate government to the Democratic Party's war chest, because the Democratic Party promised to negotiate
with the South.
And when that failed, they snuck secret agents into Chicago to try to liberate the thousands of Confederate soldiers who were imprisoned at Camp Douglas, and used them to create an army behind Union lines to disrupt the flow of supplies coming out of Chicago. And the prisoners were organized. We have memoirs of Confederate prisoners. They had weapons hidden underneath their barracks. They were just waiting for the signal of the Confederate agents to attack the camp from the outside, and they would rise up on the inside.
But fortunately,
the scheme was detected by the United States Secret Service, and
the conspirators were arrested
or forced to flee to Canada. The racism that Wilbur Story expressed through the Chicago Times was shared by many people in Chicago, particularly many new immigrants to the city, who felt that they were locked in the worst jobs in the city. And they feared African Americans coming to the city as equals, and they would have to compete for wages with them.
And so
during the Civil War, the first race riots occurred. And they occurred in situations where people were fighting for unskilled labor jobs. And the great City Council of Chicago went ahead and stepped into this and decreed that Chicago's schools should be legally segregated according to race. They tried to restrict all African Americans to one school. But African Americans who were in Chicago, and Chicago just had a small population of them, African Americans who were in Chicago did go ahead and participate meaningfully
in the conflict.
The 54th Massachusetts, the famous regiment in the movie Glory, that was partially recruited in Chicago, even though it was given a Massachusetts title.
But most interesting was the Douglas family. H. Ford Douglas
was a former slave from Virginia. He was a mulatto, so he was able to pass for white sometimes. He joined the Union Army before the Emancipation Proclamation, before it was legal for a black man to fight to end slavery. His wife led a very important organization that went ahead and tried to help what they called contrabands, African Americans who fled from slavery to the Union lines. And she tried to help them. Later, Douglas became an officer and organized his own artillery company. And he was a good friend of the more famous Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist. In 1863, in January, just after the Emancipation Proclamation was released, he wrote a letter to Frederick Douglass. Just let me read that quickly. The slaves are free. How can I write these precious words? In anticipation of this result, I enlisted 6 months ago in order to better be prepared to play my part in the great drama of the Negro's redemption. I wanted its drill. I wanted its practical details. For mere theory does not make a good soldier. I've learned something of war, for I have seen war in its brightest as well as its bloodiest phase. And yet, I have nothing to regret. For since the stern necessities of this struggle have laid bare the naked issue of freedom on one side and slavery on the other, freedom shall have, in this conflict, if necessary, my blood, as it had in the past my earnest words. This war will educate Mr. Lincoln out of his idea of deportation of the Negro quite as fast as some of his other pro-slavery ideas with respect to employing them as soldiers. You can see H. Ford Douglass didn't like the fact that Lincoln waited until 1863 to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, or that Lincoln advocated that African Americans consider relocation to other places. H. Ford Douglass advocated, he felt he was an American and he wanted American citizenship rights. Now, there were a lot of people in Chicago who were making money during the Civil War. War is a great opportunity to do that. And they did not serve. So Potter Palmer was a man young enough to serve in the military. He didn't. Marshall Field, George Pullman, Philip Danforth Armour, Gustavus Swift. Just like the other big robber barons on the East Coast, Rockefeller, Carnegie. These people saw war as a good opportunity to make money, and they stayed home and made it. They laid foundations for the greatest fortunes in American history by staying home and reaping the profits. Chicago's biggest businessman was Cyrus McCormick. the alleged inventor of the reaper. He made agricultural machinery that made it easier for farmers to harvest their crops without large pool of labor. This conceivably would have been very helpful to the Union war effort. But during the Civil War, Cyrus McCormick sold most of his reapers in Europe. He was from Virginia. He was against Lincoln and the war effort. 1864, he ran for Congress based on we should negotiate with the Confederacy and give up the Emancipation Proclamation. He secretly negotiated with Confederate agents in Canada, but conveniently burned all the letters after the war. So Chicago business people did not necessarily conduct themselves in the most glorious fashion. On the other hand, Chicago industry did play a key role in winning the war and in transforming Chicago.
It was during the Civil War that Chicago became
A big food processing and food byproducts industry center. And so many food products still come out of Chicago. Kraft Foods, Nabisco, Oreos, and Ritz crackers, Sara Lee. These things have their roots in the Civil War.
the Chicago Union
Stockyards were founded during the Civil War because Chicago became the great pork packing center
of the country during the conflict.
And that food, Chicago is the food distribution center for the country, is the reason why we have this great commodities market in Chicago. That's such a big part of Chicago's financial industry.
And that